And now turning our attention to the economy sector, let's talk about the dreaded R word, recession. Last week's reading of 2 consecutive GDP contractions sparked a Semitic debate on what constitutes a recession. Now, because U.S. GDP declined 2 quarters in a row, some people, non-economists that is, are arguing that U.S. is in a recession. Yet only the National Bureau of Economic Research in the U.S. can officially declare a downturn. So, are they or are they not in a recession? We're joined by Professor Yang Jun-sok for further discussions. Good morning, Professor Yang.
Good morning.
I think first and foremost, it's worth clarifying for all of our listeners, what is the definition of a recession and who is on this official committee that gets a say on calling it a recession after all?
Okay, well, there is no formal definition of a recession for the United States or any other country for that matter. Recession is declared by a business cycle dating committee, which is in U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. The dating committee consists of 8 ad hoc members selected by the NBER president, who's currently Professor James Paturba of MIT, who's also a member of the dating committee as well. And the head of the dating committee is Robert Hall of Stanford University, who has been a member of the dating committee since 1978. It also includes researchers and professors such as Robert J. Gordon of Northwestern University and Christina and David Romer of UC Berkeley. There's 8 members, and all of them are really impeccably honest and very famous academic economists. They have really great academic credentials, though there are some outsiders who complain that there are no minorities on the committee and women are underrepresented because there's only 2 out of 8 members who are women. But still, if you look at the credentials of the economists involved, I think very few people will have complaints about their qualifications. Now, on the NBER webpage, a recession is defined as the period between a peak of economic activity and its subsequent trough, or the lowest point, and further explains that a recession involves significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy. So it's not just 1 or 2 industries, but it has to involve the entire economy and last more than a few months. So in the interpretation of this definition, there are 3 criteria: depth, diffusion, and duration. And these are somewhat interchangeable. So while each of these criteria needs to be met individually to some degree, extreme conditions revealed by one criteria may offset weaker indications from another. So what they're basically saying is that these 8 members meet, they discuss, and then they decide whether it is a recession or not. And the problem is they look at the data and they do not define recession in real time. It waits for data, some of which are available only quarterly. And further, they always wait for revised data because initial preliminary data may only be estimated and it may turn out to be wrong when it's revised. So the reason that they do that is because the dating committee does not want to rely on unsure data. So it's the way that the NBER and the dating committee feels is that they're making an academic decision. They're making a historical decision rather than a real-time decision, which is intended to help policymakers or investors. What the dating committee wants to do is they want to leave a historical record. They want to leave an academic record so that further researchers who come along or historians who look at the economy, they can be sure that, yes, this was the period when there was a recession, rather than trying to help stock investors make a decision on whether it is currently a recession or not. So the decision whether we are undergoing a recession or not, they may wait until months or even a year after recession started, and they often decide that it was a recession only after recession actually ends. So it's in some sense not much of a help to policymakers who have to make decisions in real time or investors. It is really there because they want to leave a historical record and help future researchers rather than help people who are right now struggling to decide whether they should invest in these stocks or not.
So as for immediate analysis, this body might not be the one to look to. However, they're the only ones that can technically define a recession. Last week's reading of 2 consecutive GDP contractions, I mean, that is sort of the rule of thumb, but there is much more measuring standards that this body looks at. So then, Professor Yang, how does the dating committee decide whether or not the U.S. is in a recession? Which set of data do they look at to define a recession, as you've said, in months and sometimes a year-long process?
Okay, they look at much wider range of data than just GDP growth. They look at real personal income, less transfers. They look at non-farm payrolls. They look at real personal consumption expenditures. They look at real manufacturing and trade sales. They look at household employment. This may be the most important variable they look at. And they look at index of industrial production. And they look at the average of real GDP and real GDI. GDP, everybody knows, is gross domestic product, how much a country makes. GDI is how much a country earns. And because what you make, you usually sell, and when you sell, you get money, that's your income. Theoretically, GDP and GDI, production and income, should be the same. And they look at the average of the two because, even though theoretically GDP and GDI has to be the same, because they're calculated from different sources, there's always some errors or numbers that they could not find because some people do not report the numbers fully. So that's why they look at the average of GDP and GDI.
So then why do people, maybe even the general public, think 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth is in fact a recession? Has this always been sort of the status quo or a simpler measuring standard?
Well, it was a rule of thumb because the dating committee does not give information in real time. Stock investors had to make their decisions before the dating committee has made their decision. It was just a rule of thumb that 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth meant a recession. Usually, it works fairly well. It's not completely accurate because the dating committee seems to look at employment figures, perhaps more importantly than the production figures, but still, it worked pretty well in the past because most recessions are demand-driven. That is, you have decline in production because you have decline in demand. People do not want to buy as much, so that's why we get into a recession. But this particular recession is not quite the same. It's actually more similar to a recession we had in 1979 and 1980 when we had rises in costs, again, because of the rise in oil prices for the most part. And right now, you can even argue that demand is somewhat strong. So it's very unclear, especially for the first quarter of 2022, whether the U.S. was in a recession because they had such strong demand.
So then, based on your professional observance of the data so far, is the United States in a recession?
Okay, well, if you look at the first quarter 2022 numbers for the GDP, demand, as I said, was very strong. Even though the GDP fell by 1.6% annualized. Now, this is a bit of a bother because what the U.S. does is it looks at quarterly growth and projects how much it would fall if it maintained the same pace all year, while Korea reports GDP numbers quarter to quarter. So usually if you see an annualized number, unless it's a very high number, you can just divide by 4. So that means U.S. GDP fell by about 0.4% quarter to quarter. So it seems like production fell, but income rose. The GDI actually rose in the first quarter. And if you look at the demand component of the GDP, consumption rose by 1.8% annualized. Investment, or technically they call it gross private domestic investment, it rose by 5% annualized. Exports fell by 4.8%, but exports actually represent demand outside the United States rather than demand within the United States. So it points out weaknesses in other countries rather than the U.S. So you can plausibly use these numbers to say that U.S. actually had a very strong demand. It could have grown, but because of higher cost, because of lack of intermediate parts like semiconductors, U.S. Supply could not keep up with demand. So it goes contrary to what we usually think of as a recession, which is a fall in demand, which causes a fall in supply. Now, second quarter numbers are more mixed. GDP fell by 0.9%, so it fell less. It fell about 0.2% quarter to quarter. Consumption rose by 1.0%, but goods consumption fell by 4.4% annualized, and within the categories, durable goods, which is a major contributor to global inflation, fell by minus 2.6%. So that's actually at least good news for Korea. Global inflation may come down, but the reason that U.S. Consumption went up was because of increases in consumption for services, and investment fell by a whopping 13.5%. So especially the fall in investment may be saying that U.S. is slowing down. So there may be a case to be made that from second quarter, you're beginning to see the beginnings of a recession, but still, consumption has gone up by 1.0%. So that is not entirely clear, but at least in the second quarter, you do have a case that recession may be beginning.
Here's another important marker. U.S. also had a very strong job market in the month of July. A strong job market means the U.S. is not likely to be in a recession, right?
That seems to be so. As I said, the dating committee seems to be looking at employment numbers more than just plain production numbers. And in July, U.S. added 528,000 jobs when economists were estimating that it would rise only by 250,000. Unemployment rate is 3.5%. This is the lowest unemployment rate for the United States, matching the previous low at February 2020. Wages rose by 5.2%, which is lower than the inflation rate, but still very, very high. So U.S. labor market is acting not like it's in a recession, but it's in a boom. There's so many jobs created that it seems like demand for goods, which leads to demand for labor, is still very, very high. So along with the ambiguous data that we've seen for second quarter GDP, it's very difficult to make the case that the U.S. is in a recession right now. Now, there are indicators that U.S. economy may be slowing down. It may get into a recession in the future, but right now there's at best ambiguous evidence, and the dating committee may decide that U.S. is not yet in a recession.
So the mixed signals do make it very difficult to determine, simply put, whether the U.S. is in a slowdown. And the bottom line is the U.S. does not have a single definition for a recession, maybe a revolving door. And has the committee decide whether the U.S. is in a recession? How about Korea, Professor Yang? Does Korea have its own standard in measuring and defining a recession?
No, Korea is actually even a harder case to decide whether it is in a recession or not. Because Korea has no dating committee, Korea has not even a rule of thumb. If you use the rule of thumb that Korea has, it has to be 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. then Korea only had 4 recessions in 1979, 97, 2003, and 2020. And most people believe that Korea had more recessions than that. Another alternate rule of thumb is that Korea's growth is below the potential growth rate. And then we're going to have a lot more recessions because, well, in the 1990s, Korea's potential growth rate was 7%. So any growth rate that we had below 7% would have been counted as a recession. And there were plenty of years in the 1990s when Korea's growth rate was below 7%. But additional problem is that Korea's potential growth rate has been falling very rapidly since 1990s. Right now, it's in a mid 2% range currently. And if the current trend continues, then potential growth will fall to upper 1% range by 2030. So even if we have a growth rate that seems very low, like 1.9%, that may not be considered as a recession in, say, 2025 because it is still above potential.
It seems frustrating. You've clarified a number of points, but in trying to define a recession, so many moving parts go into it that there isn't a simple answer. But thank you very much for getting the conversation started. As always, it's been a pleasure. We'll speak to you again next week.
Thank you.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.